A school incident. The scene unfolded in the harsh fluorescent lighting of a high school hallway. A uniformed officer, standing at the center of a growing crowd of students, held a pair of sharp scissors in his hand. In front of him sat Ava, a young black girl, her face streaked with tears, her body stiff with fear and humiliation. Without any warning or justification, the officer roughly grabbed a handful of her tightly coiled hair, pulling it harshly to expose the crown of her head. With an almost mechanical coldness, he began cutting her hair, each snip echoing through the silent hallway like a statement of power. The officer's actions were not merely the result of an isolated moment. They were the culmination of escalating tension between him and Ava. Earlier that day, during a classroom discussion, Ava had challenged his authority, voicing her concerns about law enforcement practices, specifically in relation to race. Her words had clearly struck a nerve, and in his mind, this act of defiance had crossed a line. He viewed her challenge as an affront to his position, his power, and perhaps even to the very authority he believed he held over the students. As he stood over her, the officer's voice broke the silence, laced with anger and condescension. "Maybe now you'll learn some respect," he sneered, his words dripping with disdain. "You think you're better than everyone else just because of your little speech? Well, let's see how proud you are now." With each cut of the scissors, a piece of Ava's identity seemed to fall away, scattered like the hair on the floor, leaving her not just physically altered but emotionally crushed. The officer's actions were a clear abuse of power, an attempt to silence a young girl by humiliating her in front of her peers. It was a stark reminder of the dangers that come when authority figures, instead of guiding and protecting, use their position to intimidate and control. Ava sat frozen in her chair, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The officer's hands were firm, pulling and cutting through her thick hair without a single ounce of empathy. Her mind raced, trying to process what was happening, but her body felt paralyzed, unable to escape the situation. Every snip of the scissors was like a cruel reminder of her helplessness, and as her hair fell to the floor in uneven clumps, she felt a deep sense of violation. The hallway around her was filled with the sounds of whispering students, but none of them intervened. Some simply stood motionless, their eyes wide with shock, while others took out their phones, capturing every moment of her humiliation. The fear of retaliation seemed to keep them all at bay. They were complicit in the silence, unsure of what to do but unwilling to risk speaking out against the officer who wielded so much authority in that moment. Ava wanted to scream, to run, to fight back, but her legs felt as though they were glued to the chair, unable to move as the officer continued his degrading act. In the midst of this nightmare, a teacher stepped forward, her voice shaking with urgency. "Officer, this isn't right. You can't do this. She's just a kid," she pleaded, trying to step between Ava and the officer. But her words were drowned out by the officer's response, his voice booming with authority as he dismissed her plea. "She broke the rules, and I'm doing what needs to be done," he retorted sharply, his tone unyielding. The teacher hesitated, her own fear apparent in her hesitation, and within moments she stepped back, seemingly defeated by the officer's refusal to listen. Her intervention was nothing more than a fleeting moment of resistance, quickly crushed by the overwhelming power of the officer. The other students remained still, either too afraid or too unsure to take any real action. Ava's heart pounded in her chest, the shame and humiliation burning deeper than the tears streaming down her face. She was caught in a moment where her dignity was stripped away, her identity reduced to a victim of abuse, both physical and emotional. But what was even more painful was the overwhelming sense of abandonment. In this moment of crisis, those who could have helped remained silent, choosing instead to watch, record, and stay out of the way. The tense silence that had fallen over the hallway was shattered by the sound of the school's front doors slamming open. Heavy footsteps echoed, each one reverberating with a sense of urgency. Students turned in unison, their gazes following the figure that stepped into the scene, his presence commanding and undeniable. Malcolm Brooks, Ava's father, moved swiftly through the crowd, his dark suit sharp against the sterile school setting. His badge caught the fluorescent light as he made his way to the center of the commotion. Ava, her eyes filled with a mix of disbelief and relief, watched as her father approached. Her heart raced, the fear that had paralyzed her slowly giving way to something stronger, hope. But the officer, still gripping the scissors, didn't seem to recognize the weight of the moment. He hesitated for just a second before his eyes met Malcolm's, a flicker of unease passing through him. The officer's mouth opened, but before he could say a word, Malcolm's voice cut through the tension with the force of a hammer. "What are you doing here?" the officer barked, trying to assert control over the situation. "This is a school matter." Malcolm's expression hardened as he looked the officer squarely in the eye. His voice was calm, but filled with unshakable authority. "No," he said, his words sharp and final. "This is a federal matter now." The weight of those words hit the officer like a physical blow. The crowd, sensing the shift in power, held their breath. Students glanced at one another, some with wide eyes, others with barely suppressed smiles of relief. The officer, once so confident in his actions, now stood frozen, his hand trembling slightly as he held the scissors. Malcolm's gaze never wavered as he stepped forward, his voice now lower but brimming with authority. "Step away from my daughter," he commanded, his tone a clear warning that left no room for negotiation. The officer's confidence unraveled before the intensity of Malcolm's presence. With a hesitant, trembling motion, the officer dropped the scissors to the floor, the sharp sound of metal hitting the tile echoing throughout the hallway. The crowd collectively exhaled, some murmuring in disbelief at the sudden turn of events. Ava looked up at her father, her eyes wide with a mix of emotions, gratitude, disbelief, and a deep, quiet sense of justice finally being served. She had known her father was an FBI agent, but she had never seen him wield his authority so decisively. It was a side of him she had only heard about in stories, but now she saw it firsthand, his unwavering commitment to protecting those he loved, no matter the cost. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," Malcolm continued, his voice low but filled with controlled fury as he addressed the officer. "You abused your power, and now you're going to face the consequences." The officer, realizing that his actions would no longer be ignored, stammered, his once confident demeanor crumbling in the face of Malcolm's unyielding stance. He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. With a quiet but firm gesture, Malcolm pulled out his phone, dialing a number that set the wheels of accountability in motion. Within moments, additional agents appeared at the door, their presence imposing and unquestionable. The tension in the hallway was palpable as the officer, who had moments ago been the one in control, now found himself surrounded by the very people he had once believed would never question his authority. As the agents moved in, the officer was handcuffed, his resistance futile. The students, once silent bystanders, now began to murmur among themselves, some recording the moment, others unable to hide their shock and satisfaction. Ava's gaze remained fixed on her father, the man who had appeared when she needed him most, and for the first time she allowed herself to believe that justice might actually prevail. The officer, now visibly shaken, was quickly overpowered by the FBI agents who had arrived with Malcolm. His attempts to resist were futile, as they swiftly and efficiently placed him in handcuffs, his body stiffening in disbelief as the cold metal snapped around his wrists. The once authoritative figure who had threatened Ava now found himself a prisoner, escorted out of the school with an air of humiliation clinging to him. His head hung low, unable to meet the eyes of the students who had witnessed his abuse of power. Malcolm, standing tall and unwavering, remained beside his daughter as the agents led the officer away. His presence was a silent fortress of strength, offering Ava a shield against the chaos that had just unfolded. Though the situation was far from over, his steady demeanor gave Ava a sense of safety she hadn't felt before. She had always known her father as a protector, but seeing him in action, handling the situation with such precision and authority, made her realize the full weight of his commitment to justice. Ava's hands trembled slightly, but she stood tall beside him, no longer the frightened girl she had been moments before. Her eyes, still wide with the residual shock of the ordeal, met her father's. In them he saw not just gratitude, but a newfound sense of resilience. She wasn't the same girl she had been when the officer first approached her. She had witnessed firsthand the power of standing up against injustice, and now her father had shown her what it meant to ensure accountability. The students, once paralyzed by fear and confusion, began to stir, their murmurs growing louder as the reality of the situation set in. Some were still recording on their phones, others whispering among themselves about what had just transpired. The air was thick with disbelief, but there was an undercurrent of something more, something that had been missing until now. There was a sense of empowerment, of witnessing the right thing being done at long last. Malcolm, however, did not allow the moment to linger in triumph. His eyes, sharp and unwavering, shifted toward the school administrators who had silently watched the incident unfold, their faces pale and unwilling to meet his gaze. It was clear that the staff had failed to intervene, allowing the officer to act without restraint. Turning to the principal, Malcolm's voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable edge of authority in it. "This should never have happened." He said his words calm but filled with an undeniable weight. "You allowed this officer to abuse his power, and you failed to protect my daughter. You will be held accountable for your inaction." The principal, visibly flustered, stammered, "Mr. Brooks, we didn't know how." "No," Malcolm interjected, his voice cutting through the feeble excuses. "You should have known. As educators and administrators, your responsibility is to ensure the safety and well-being of the students here. You failed, and there will be consequences." His words hung in the air like a warning. The principal's face turned pale, and the staff members around him shifted uncomfortably. They had been complicit in turning a blind eye, and now they were being forced to confront the reality of their negligence. Malcolm placed a reassuring hand on Ava's shoulder, his grip firm and protective. "You're safe now, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice soft yet resolute. "But this is just the beginning." As the FBI agents escorted the officer out of the building, the tension in the hallway began to ease, but the ripple effects of the confrontation were just beginning to spread throughout the school. Malcolm wasn't just taking a stand for his daughter, he was setting a precedent. He was demanding that those in positions of power, no matter who they were, be held accountable for their actions. And he wasn't going to stop until that message was heard loud and clear. Ava, though still processing the emotional weight of the events, allowed herself a moment to breathe. She was no longer alone in this battle. Her father had shown her what it meant to stand up for what was right, and together they would ensure that the officer's abuse of power wouldn't be forgotten. Despite years of investigation, the case remains one of the most haunting and unresolved mysteries in the Pacific Northwest. The bodies of several victims, including Mai and Stephen, have never been found, leaving their families and the community in a state of perpetual uncertainty. These disappearances and brutal murders have left behind a trail of unanswered questions, and despite numerous efforts to uncover the truth, the killer or killers have never been definitively identified. Even with advances in forensic technology over the years, the case has stubbornly resisted resolution. DNA analysis, improved investigative methods, and new forensic tools have been employed in an attempt to connect the dots, but no direct evidence has ever been uncovered that links any particular person, whether Zane or someone else, to the crimes. The lack of physical evidence, combined with the mystery surrounding the victims' last moments, has made it nearly impossible for investigators to make any solid breakthroughs. For the families of Mai, Stephen, and the other victims, the pain of not knowing what happened to their loved ones is an ongoing struggle. The fact that so many pieces of the puzzle remain missing, such as the locations of certain bodies and the identity of the killer, has made closure almost impossible. While the passage of time may have dimmed the intensity of media coverage, the case still lingers in the hearts and minds of those who remember the victims, and the terror that gripped the region during the early 1980s. The mystery remains unresolved, leaving both the community and law enforcement searching for answers that continue to elude them. For law enforcement, the investigation into the unsolved murders in the Lewis-Clark Valley has been a particularly vexing and frustrating challenge. Investigators have long held a strong suspicion about the potential involvement of a man like Zane, yet the lack of conclusive proof has made it nearly impossible to bring him or anyone else to justice. The case has been a relentless pursuit of leads that seem to go nowhere, a cycle of questioning and re-questioning suspects, and a never-ending search for that one crucial piece of evidence that could tie everything together. Investigators have scoured the crime scenes, revisited old evidence with fresh eyes, and even relied on modern forensic technology to uncover new clues. Yet, each time they thought they were getting closer to an answer, the case seemed to slip further away, leaving them feeling like they were chasing shadows. The frustration of working on a case where the evidence is so circumstantial, where the connections are there but the proof is not, has taken its toll on law enforcement. The lingering questions: did Zane commit these crimes? Were the victims all linked to the same killer? Have haunted the officers involved, especially as years passed and new leads failed to materialize. They know they're close, but they've never been able to crack the case wide open. What adds to the difficulty is the emotional weight of the case. The victims' families, still waiting for justice and closure, rely on law enforcement to provide the answers that have remained elusive for decades. This pressure can be overwhelming, and the more time that passes, the harder it becomes to maintain hope that the case will ever be solved. Ultimately, the unresolved nature of these crimes has left law enforcement in a state of limbo, suspicious yet unable to act, determined, but without the clear evidence they need to bring the killer to justice. The case remains one of the most frustrating in the history of local law enforcement, as they continue to search for answers that may never come. In the days following the incident, Ava's mind seemed to race in 100 directions at once, each thought tinged with the rawness of what had happened. The image of the officer's hands hovering above her, the sound of scissors snipping through her hair, echoed in her mind like a relentless, unforgiving drumbeat. Her body felt tense, as though it hadn't yet realized the ordeal was over. Her scalp still burned with the phantom sensation of the officer's touch. Though physically safe, emotionally, she was anything but. Ava had always been strong. People told her she had a sense of resilience that belied her years. But that strength was now being tested in ways she never could have imagined. The trauma wasn't just in the act itself, but in the aftermath, in the silence that followed. While her father had stormed into the school and demanded justice, the reality was that no one had been there for her in that moment. No teacher had come to her defense. No staff member had intervened to stop the officer when it became clear that things had crossed the line. The people who were supposed to protect her, who were supposed to care for her well-being, had failed her in the worst possible way. Ava struggled to understand how the people who were meant to guide and protect her had abandoned her. She could still feel the weight of their inaction, a burden she hadn't asked to carry. It wasn't just the officer's behavior that haunted her. It was the knowledge that the adults she had trusted had let her down when it mattered most. At school, the stares of her classmates became a new form of torment. Some had recorded the incident on their phones, capturing the humiliation for all to see. Others whispered behind her back, unsure of how to approach her or whether they had done enough. The air was thick with awkwardness and pity, but Ava didn't want their sympathy. What she needed was justice, and what she needed was an apology from those who had stood by and done nothing. But the silence of the adults in the school was deafening. No teacher had approached her to ask if she was okay. No counselor had called to offer support, to help her process the overwhelming emotions that came with such an ordeal. Even now, days later, she had yet to hear from the principal, who had been the first to dismiss her father's demands when the situation unfolded. Ava's emotional landscape was a patchwork of confusion, hurt, and anger. How was she supposed to heal from this when the very institution she had trusted had let her down? How could she trust any of them again? Her sense of safety had been shattered, not just by the officer's actions, but by the failure of the very adults she had been taught to rely on. In some ways, their silence felt like a betrayal, like they were complicit in the officer's actions by failing to act when they could have. She often found herself lying awake at night, the darkness amplifying her thoughts, her emotions spiraling into a place of loneliness and doubt. Would the other students understand? Would they see the injustice for what it was? She feared that the longer the adults stayed quiet, the more it would feel like the whole thing had been swept under the rug, like it had never happened at all. But deep down, Ava knew she couldn't stay silent. Her father had stood up for her, fought for her when no one else would. And in the midst of her pain, she found a flicker of determination to do the same. She didn't want to just be the girl who had been humiliated. She wanted to be the girl who fought back, who used her voice to ensure that what happened to her never happened to anyone else. In the quiet of her room, with the weight of the world on her shoulders, Ava made a promise to herself. She would heal. But she would also make sure that the silence around her would not last forever. She would take back her power, no matter how long it took, and she would ensure that those who had failed her were held accountable. As the days passed, Ava's resolve only grew stronger. The quiet ache of betrayal, the emotional scars from the officer's attack, began to take a different shape, one of anger, determination, and a deep desire for change. She couldn't forget what had happened to her, but more than that, she couldn't forget the faces of those who had let it happen. The teachers, the principal, the staff members, each had stood by, turning a blind eye while an officer crossed a line that should have never been allowed to exist. Ava had come to realize that this wasn't just about her. This was about the system that had failed her and others like her. Her father, Malcolm, had been the first to fight for her, but Ava knew that it couldn't stop there. This wasn't just a matter of personal vindication, it was a matter of justice. And justice didn't just require the officer to be held accountable, it required those who had enabled him to face the consequences of their actions as well. One afternoon, after she had gathered her thoughts, Ava stood in front of a group of reporters, her father standing beside her, unwavering in his support. The cameras clicked and whirred, capturing every moment, but Ava barely noticed them. She was focused on her message, the one she needed the world to hear. "I'm not standing here today because of what happened to me," she began, her voice clear, but carrying the weight of everything she had been through. "I'm standing here because this should never have happened in the first place. What happened to me wasn't just the fault of one officer, it was the fault of an entire system that allowed him to act this way. It was the fault of the adults who were supposed to protect me, but instead they allowed this abuse to continue." Her words rang out, bold and unflinching. "The officer who cut my hair didn't just violate my body, he violated my dignity. And the teachers, the principal, the people who were supposed to be there for me, who were supposed to speak out when something was wrong, they failed me. They watched. They did nothing." Ava paused, taking a deep breath. Her father, standing just behind her, placed a supportive hand on her shoulder, a silent but powerful show of solidarity. But Ava's words were her own, spoken from a place of truth and anger that burned in her chest. "I want justice," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I want those responsible for letting this happen to be held accountable. No one should have the power to treat a child like that, and no one should be allowed to stand by and do nothing when they see it happening. We can't be silent anymore. We can't let this kind of injustice go unchallenged." Ava's gaze swept across the crowd of reporters, meeting their eyes as if daring them to ignore her words. "I refuse to let what happened to me be something that's forgotten or swept under the rug. I'm not the only one who's suffered from a broken system. There are so many others out there who have been silenced, whose pain has gone unnoticed. I won't let this be just another story of abuse that fades into the background." Her voice cracked slightly as she added, "I want people to understand that standing up against injustice isn't just about speaking out when it's convenient. It's about doing the right thing, even when it's hard, even when it's uncomfortable. I'm asking for accountability, I'm asking for change, and I'm asking for others to join me in this fight." Ava's father, proud of his daughter's courage, stepped forward to speak. His presence was one of strength, but it was also a reminder that this wasn't just Ava's battle. It was his too. He had fought for justice his whole career, and now he was standing by her side as she took the lead in her own fight. "We've all seen the damage done when power is abused, when people choose silence over action," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "But we're here today to make it clear that we will not allow this to continue. We will not allow our children to be treated this way. We will stand up for justice, no matter the cost." Ava looked up at her father, her heart swelling with gratitude and pride. In that moment, she knew that they were in this together. She wasn't alone, and neither was anyone else who had ever been harmed by an unjust system. The fight for accountability had begun, and she would see it through to the end. Ava takes the bold step of publicly demanding justice, not only for herself, but for others who have faced similar abuses. Her words reflect a call for systemic change, accountability, and a challenge to others to stand up against injustice. With her father by her side, she uses her voice to amplify the need for a better, more just system. Ava's brave stand didn't go unnoticed. Her words, filled with pain but also the promise of change, spread quickly, igniting a firestorm of support across the country. News outlets picked up the story, and soon Ava's name became synonymous with resilience in the face of injustice. The power of her voice resonated not only within the walls of her school but across communities, cities, and even states. What had started as a single, personal act of abuse had turned into a rallying cry for those who had long been silenced by fear, by power, and by a system that failed to protect them. The aftermath of the incident triggered a wave of protests as students, parents, and activists marched outside schools, demanding accountability for the officers' actions. Signs reading "Justice for Ava" and "No More Silence" filled the streets, while social media buzzed with hashtags like #AvasVoice and "Stop the Abuse." The protests were peaceful but powerful, each person adding their voice to the growing demand for justice, for reform, and for the end of racial violence in schools. Petitions were launched, gathering hundreds of thousands of signatures. The demands were clear: an independent investigation into the officer's actions, disciplinary action against all those complicit in his abuse, and policy changes to ensure that such incidents never occurred again. Ava's story had become a symbol of the need for change, an example of how one young person's courage could ignite a movement that reached far beyond what anyone had anticipated. As public pressure mounted, the school board and district were forced to take action. The officer who had once wielded his power without consequence was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. He was later fired, facing legal action for his abuse of power and violation of Ava's rights. The legal process was slow, but it was unrelenting. Criminal charges were brought against him, and the case was pursued with the full weight of the law, marking a significant step in holding those who abused their positions accountable. But the fight didn't end there. Ava's family, with the support of civil rights organizations, filed a lawsuit against the school district, demanding compensation for Ava's trauma and seeking policy reforms that would protect other students from similar abuses. The lawsuit highlighted the school's failure to intervene and its complicity in allowing the officer's actions to continue unchecked. As the case proceeded, Ava's courage continued to inspire others to speak out. Teachers, students, and even former school staff came forward, sharing their stories of witnessing abuse of power or racism within the school system. It became clear that Ava's experience was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of systemic issues that needed to be addressed. The school district, facing mounting public pressure and the looming legal threat, began implementing policy changes. New protocols were introduced to ensure that school officials were trained in handling incidents of racial violence and abuse. A zero-tolerance policy for discrimination was enacted, and all school staff were required to undergo regular training on cultural competency, de-escalation techniques, and students' rights. While these changes were a start, they were only the beginning. Ava's fight sparked a broader conversation about school safety, racial justice, and the need for reform within educational institutions. Local and national lawmakers began drafting legislation aimed at preventing the abuse of power by school resource officers and ensuring that students, especially students of color, were given the protection and respect they deserved. Ava, now a symbol of resistance, continued to speak out on behalf of those who had been silenced. She traveled to rallies, shared her story in interviews, and used her platform to call for long-lasting change. Her courage had ignited a national conversation, one that was difficult to ignore, impossible to dismiss. The officers' actions had changed Ava's life forever, but in doing so, they had sparked a movement that held the promise of a future where no child would have to suffer as she had. Ava's bravery led to public exposure, sparking a nationwide movement for justice. The officer faced legal consequences, and the story brought about policy changes in schools across the country. Ava's experience became a catalyst for reform, inspiring a broader conversation about racial justice, systemic abuse, and the need for accountability within educational systems. Ava's journey didn't end with the officer's dismissal or the legal victories that followed. Instead, those moments marked the beginning of a transformation within her, a deep, powerful shift from a young girl reeling from trauma to an unwavering advocate for racial justice. The days following the incident were challenging, filled with emotional turbulence as Ava grappled with her pain. But as she found solace in her father Malcolm's steadfast support and the outpouring of love from her community, a sense of empowerment began to take root. With every passing day, Ava's voice grew louder. She realized that her story was not just her own. It was the story of countless others who had suffered in silence, too afraid or too unheard to speak up. Ava, once frozen in fear, now stood with renewed confidence, determined to use her experience as a platform for change. Her father, Malcolm, played a crucial role in her transformation. As an FBI agent and someone who understood the weight of authority, he had been Ava's rock throughout the ordeal. He had shown her that standing up for what is right doesn't always come without sacrifice, but it was worth it. Malcolm's unwavering belief in justice became the foundation on which Ava built her advocacy. His guidance gave her the courage to speak in public forums, to address crowds, and to challenge systems that perpetuated harm. Soon, Ava became a powerful voice for racial justice, not just within her school but across the nation. She was invited to speak at rallies, town halls, and national conferences. Ava shared her experience in a way that was raw, vulnerable, but also resolute. She spoke of the hurt, the humiliation, and the abuse she had endured at the hands of the officer, but she also spoke of hope. The hope that things could change if enough people stood together. She became a beacon of resilience, showing that even in the darkest moments, one could find the strength to rise and fight back. In her speeches, Ava often reminded others of the importance of standing up against injustice, no matter how daunting the challenge might seem. She encouraged people to use their voices, especially those who had been marginalized or silenced, to demand a fairer world. She shared stories of others who had fought and won, inspiring people who were afraid to speak out. Ava's advocacy became a call to action for everyone who witnessed her strength, a reminder that silence in the face of wrongdoing was complicity. As she grew in her advocacy, Ava began to work with organizations that focused on racial justice and the rights of students. She partnered with groups that worked to end police brutality in schools, pushing for greater oversight and accountability for school resource officers and other authority figures. Ava's tireless advocacy led her to help draft legislation aimed at protecting students of color from abuse, ensuring that the power dynamics in schools would no longer go unchecked. But it wasn't just about creating laws, it was about creating a cultural shift. Ava's efforts helped spark conversations about the importance of diversity and inclusion in schools, calling for systems that celebrated rather than oppressed students' identities. She pushed for educational curricula that taught students about the history of racial injustice and the importance of empathy and understanding. Her message was clear. Real change came not just through legal action, but through changing the very fabric of society's mindset. Through her advocacy, Ava found her true calling. She didn't just become a victim of the system, she became a change-maker, someone who used her personal pain as a force for good. She became a voice for the voiceless, a symbol of the power of resilience and a reminder that no matter how young or how small, anyone could challenge the injustices they faced. Ava's transformation was not immediate, nor was it easy. But as the months passed, the young girl who had once been silenced by fear was now a leader in the fight for justice. And through it all, she never forgot the importance of love and support from those who stood beside her, especially her father, whose unwavering belief in her had fueled the fire of her passion for change. Her advocacy didn't just impact laws or policies, it impacted lives. Ava showed the world that no matter the adversity one faces, empowerment could be found through the strength of community and the courage to speak truth to power. She had become an embodiment of the change she so desperately sought, and in doing so, she inspired a generation of young people to stand up, to speak out, and to believe that justice could and would prevail. Ava evolves from a traumatized student into a powerful advocate for racial justice. Drawing strength from her father and the support of her community, she uses her voice to inspire change and fight for a world where students, especially students of color, are treated with dignity and respect. Her journey highlights the importance of empowerment, resilience, and the collective fight against systemic injustice. The video, as it comes to a close, captures a moment of quiet introspection. Ava, standing tall before the camera, looks directly into the lens, her eyes filled with a mixture of resolve and vulnerability. Her voice is steady, yet the weight of her words echoes with the deep truth she has come to understand through her painful journey. "Silence is a choice," she says, her voice unwavering, "and when we choose silence in the face of injustice, we are complicit. But when we speak up, when we stand together, we can make a difference." The screen fades to black as Ava's words linger in the air, offering viewers a moment to reflect on their own actions. It is a call to action, not just for those who witnessed her pain, but for everyone who has ever encountered injustice in any form. Ava's message is clear. We all have a responsibility to act when we see wrong being done. In the silence of the video's ending, there is a powerful invitation to pause and think about how each person contributes to the world around them. Ava's voice transcends the individual incident. It becomes a broader message about collective responsibility and the importance of standing up, even when the path forward feels uncertain or difficult. "Speaking up isn't always easy," Ava continues, her voice now softer but no less potent. "But it's necessary. You don't have to be perfect or have all the answers. You just need to care. When we care, we change things." Her reflection isn't just about the need to challenge authority or the system. It's about understanding the power of individual agency in creating change. Ava's words are an invitation for viewers to ask themselves, what will you do when you see injustice? Will you remain silent, or will you speak out? The video's final frame shows Ava, no longer just the victim, but the empowered advocate who has turned her trauma into a platform for transformation. Her face, marked by a blend of strength and compassion, conveys that it is never too late to take action. The call to action is more than just a plea. It's an urgent reminder that every small act of defiance against injustice adds up. Whether it's confronting a situation in a school, standing up for a classmate, or speaking out in a community, Ava's journey proves that one voice, no matter how young or unheard, can ignite a ripple of change. As the screen goes completely dark, Ava's final words resonate. We all have a choice. Choose action. Absolutely, you've captured the essence of the video brilliantly. It is a powerful and poignant narrative that transcends the personal trauma Ava endured and transforms it into a universal call for social change. The themes of racial injustice, abuse of authority, and the need for accountability resonate on multiple levels, urging viewers to confront uncomfortable truths and take action. By showcasing Ava's transformation from victim to advocate, the video underscores the profound impact that resilience, courage, and community support can have in the fight against systemic injustice. Her father's role as both protector and guide highlights the importance of mentorship, solidarity, and the unwavering belief in justice as a force for change. The video also brings attention to the broader implications of institutional failures, especially in schools, and how the silence of those who witness injustice contributes to the perpetuation of harmful systems. It makes it clear that accountability is not just about legal or policy changes, it's about a societal shift in how we view our responsibility to one another and the collective good. In its closing moments, the video transforms Ava's personal experience into a message for the world. Silence is complicit, and standing up, no matter how difficult, is necessary. By encouraging viewers to choose action and to examine their own roles in the face of injustice, the video serves as a clarion call for social responsibility, advocacy, and the relentless pursuit of justice for all. Ava's story is not just hers. It's a mirror to the challenges we all face in a world that needs change, and it challenges us to be the voices of change, to be brave enough to speak up, and to ensure that the future we create is one where dignity and equality are upheld for everyone.